What if the very place meant to deliver justice tried to strip you of your dignity instead? Today we're diving into the extraordinary true story of Judge Simone Carter, a woman who walked into a courthouse as a citizen and emerged as a symbol of unstoppable courage. Betrayed, humiliated, but never broken, Simone turned her pain into power, exposing a system built on silence and fear. This is a story about resilience, truth, and the fight to make justice real for everyone, not just the privileged few. If this story moves you, and trust me it will, don't forget to like this video, drop a comment below to share your thoughts, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. Let's keep these voices alive. Let's keep standing for what's right, together. The morning air in Charleston hung heavy with the early warmth of a southern spring. Judge Simone Carter, a composed 53-year-old black woman with silver-threaded coils pinned neatly to her scalp, stepped out of her silver Buick and approached the looming entrance of the Charleston Federal Courthouse. She carried herself like she always did, with quiet authority, dignity pressed into every movement. Clad in a navy blue blazer and slacks, her slim leather portfolio tucked under one arm, she looked like any professional woman heading into work. She preferred it that way. No robe, no escorts, just a citizen among citizens. Her heels clicked lightly against the concrete steps as she made her way toward the main security checkpoint, where the stone pillars cast long shadows over the waiting crowd. A few clerks nodded absently at her as they passed, but otherwise she moved unnoticed, and she liked it that way. But the moment she reached the metal detectors, the energy shifted. Deputy Charles Brenner stood by the checkpoint, arms crossed tightly over his broad chest. At 50 years old, Brenner had the look of a man who had long stopped pretending he served anything but his own sense of power. His face, worn and hardened, twisted into a frown the moment he caught sight of Simone. "Ma'am," he barked, voice sharp and disrespectful, "step out of line." Simone, used to daily scrutiny but never inured to its sting, stopped. She met his eyes, calm but firm. "Is there a problem, deputy?" Brenner didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his eyes travel over her appearance, her tidy silver hair, her pressed blazer, her calm self-assurance. He didn't recognize her, didn't care to. To him, she was just another black woman daring to look like she belonged. "No ID displayed. Can't just walk into a federal building looking like that," he muttered under his breath. Without a word, Simone reached into her blazer and produced her federal identification, her judge's badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. She held it out steadily. Brenner snatched it from her hand, barely glancing at it before stuffing it into his pocket without comment. "I would like that returned immediately," Simone said, her tone neutral but cutting. Brenner sneered. "In a hurry, sweetheart?" he said, his voice low and mocking. The younger guard at the X-ray machine, Rachel Evans, just 24 years old, wide-eyed and clearly uncomfortable, shifted nervously but said nothing. Simone remained composed. "I need to get to a courtroom," she said. Brenner didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer, invading her space. "Random check," he announced loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Procedure." Without waiting for permission, he grabbed Simone roughly by the arm and pulled her away from the checkpoint, steering her down a deserted side hallway into a windowless screening room. Inside, the sterile fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead. A single steel chair sat in the center of the room, beside a battered cart holding a handheld scanner and a pair of electric clippers. Simone's heart hammered once in her chest, but her face gave away nothing. "I do not consent to this search," she said clearly. "You have no cause to detain me." Brenner smirked. "Acting suspicious. That's cause enough." He gestured at the chair. "Sit down." When she didn't immediately comply, 2 additional officers entered the room, one older, one young and jumpy. They flanked her like wolves. This is a violation of my rights, Simone stated. Brenner leaned closer. You think flashing that badge means something to me? You're nobody in here. Simone's breath stayed even. Years of experience in tense courtrooms, of facing down powerful men in polished suits, had trained her for moments like this. But nothing could prepare her for what came next. Without warning, Brenner powered on the clippers. The harsh buzzing filled the small room, vibrating against the walls. Simone tried to rise, but strong hands pushed her into the chair. Before she could protest again, she felt the cold bite of the clippers against her scalp. A heavy silver coil fell onto the tile floor. Then another, and another. She sat rigid, refusing to let them see her break as her dignity was stripped away, lock by lock. One of the officers snickered. She looks better already, he muttered. Should have shown some respect, Brenner added, flicking hair from his uniform sleeve. Now you look presentable. Simone's fists clenched tightly in her lap, but her voice when it came was low and dangerous. You'll regret this, Brenner laughed. Yeah, sure we will. He dropped her badge onto the desk with a thud. You're free to go, lady. Courtroom's that way. Simone rose slowly, retrieving her portfolio with trembling fingers. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Not yet. As she stepped back into the main hallway, every step was heavier than the last, but not from shame, from purpose. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because what they didn't know, what they hadn't even bothered to ask, was that she wasn't. Simone Carter moved through the courthouse corridors like a ghost slipping between worlds. Her head still tingled where Deputy Charles Brenner's clippers had violated it, the faint breeze from the central air brushing her exposed scalp with every step. But if there was any crack in her dignity, she buried it deep, behind the steel in her spine. Her polished heels struck the marble floor with sharp precision, each step announcing not defeat, but purpose. The clerks who had witnessed the humiliating scene at security now avoided her gaze. A few whispered, some winced with shame, but none stepped forward to intervene or even acknowledge what had happened. She pushed open the double doors of courtroom 3, and for a split second, a hush fell across the assembled crowd. The courtroom was packed. Attorneys huddled over their notes. Reporters, including Lisa, a 29-year-old journalist with keen eyes and a press badge clipped to her blazer, perched near the back. Plaintiffs and defendants shifted anxiously in their seats, all waiting for the judge to enter and start the morning's high-profile hearing. A case of police misconduct that had drawn national attention. Simone kept moving, ignoring the stares, the confusion, the small gasps rippling through the room. Her scalp was raw, her soul seared, but her face was unreadable. And then, without ceremony, she stepped behind the towering mahogany bench, dropped her leather portfolio onto the desk, and reached for the black robe draped over the chair. The silence was deafening. Deputy Charles Brenner, still stationed stiffly at the side door like a sentry, turned toward the movement and froze. His jaw slackened. The color drained from his face as realization crashed into him like a freight train. The woman he had shoved, the woman he had humiliated, the woman whose hair still littered the screening room floor, was about to sit in judgment over this court. Simone Carter slid her arms into the sleeves of the robe with slow, deliberate movements. She smoothed it down over her shoulders, adjusting it like armor. Every tug another stake driven through the remnants of Brenner's smugness. No one spoke. No one dared. The young clerk at the corner of the bench, Rachel Evans, stumbled to her feet, eyes wide with fear and awe. She fumbled the docket book in her hands. Your Honor, we're ready to begin, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. Simone nodded once, the motion sharp, regal. She lowered herself into the judge's chair with a grace that belied the firestorm inside her. She placed her hands neatly on the desk and lifted her eyes to scan the room. We are now in session, she announced, her voice calm controlled, and carrying the full weight of the court's authority. Murmurs flickered through the gallery like sparks. Reporters leaned forward, phones and pens poised. Lisa's mouth parted in stunned disbelief. Cameras from national outlets were already capturing this moment, even though they didn't yet fully understand its magnitude. Deputy Brenner tried to shrink into the shadows by the door, but Simone's gaze found him easily. "First matter of business," she said smoothly, as if nothing at all were unusual. "Deputy Brenner, approach the bench." The words cracked across the courtroom like a whip. Every eye turned to him. Brenner hesitated, his boots glued to the floor. "I said approach," Simone repeated, her tone razor sharp. With the gait of a condemned man, Brenner shuffled forward, each step a confession. He stopped just short of the bench, towering over the polished wood, but somehow looking small, ridiculous. Simone leaned forward slightly, hands steepled before her. "State your full name and title for the record," she said. "Deputy Charles Brenner," he croaked. "Federal Courthouse Security." She nodded as if confirming an entry on an invisible ledger. "For the record," she continued, "Deputy Brenner detained, assaulted, and humiliated a federal judge on these premises less than 30 minutes ago. This same officer conducted an unauthorized search, violated civil rights protocol, and engaged in degrading behavior unbecoming of his office." The room held its breath. Rachel Evans, the young clerk, looked close to tears. Simone didn't waver. "In light of these events, I am formally requesting an immediate federal investigation into Deputy Brenner's conduct, to be submitted to the Department of Justice by close of business today." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle across the room. "And pending the outcome of that investigation," she continued, voice like tempered steel, "you are hereby suspended from duty, effective immediately." The shock on Brenner's face was almost pitiable. Almost. "Officers," Simone said, signaling the two marshals stationed at the rear of the room. "Escort Deputy Brenner out of my courtroom." The marshals moved swiftly. Within seconds, Brenner was seized, disarmed, and marched out the doors he had once guarded so arrogantly. Only after he was gone did Simone turn her attention back to the assembled courtroom. "Now," she said, adjusting her papers calmly, "shall we proceed with today's hearing?" The attorneys at the prosecution table scrambled to rise, stammering acknowledgments. The defense lawyers, visibly rattled, whispered furiously among themselves. Lisa, the journalist, scribbled furiously in her notepad, but Simone wasn't finished setting the tone. "Before we begin witness testimony," she said, "I want to be clear. This court will not tolerate misconduct, intimidation, or bias of any kind within its walls." She allowed her gaze to travel slowly across the gallery, over the police officers, the attorneys, the journalists, the public. No one is above the law, not even those tasked with enforcing it. There was no applause, no outcry, just a silence so profound it hummed in the air. Simone gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Prosecution, call your first witness." The proceedings moved forward, but nothing about that courtroom was the same anymore. Word of the morning's events spread like wildfire through the courthouse. Civil rights attorneys whispered fiercely to each other in the hallways. Clerks who had once looked away now stood a little straighter. Even the most jaded reporters sensed they were witnessing something historic. Back in her chambers during a brief recess, Simone stood by the window, watching as small crowds began to gather on the courthouse steps outside. Among them, she spotted Reverend Samuel Brooks, a tall, weathered man of 62, making his way toward the front with a quiet, steady purpose. He was followed by community members, activists, students. They held no signs. They carried no bullhorns. Their presence alone was statement enough. There was a soft knock on the chamber door. Rachel Evans stepped inside, clutching a clipboard to her chest. "Your Honor," she said hesitantly, I I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I saw what happened this morning. I didn't know what to do." Simone turned to her, the fire in her chest softening slightly. "You did what you could, Rachel," she said. "You're doing it now." The young woman blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. "If you need me to testify, or anything," Simone smiled gently, "I know where to find you." Rachel nodded, her hands trembling. "Thank you, Your Honor." As she left, Simone returned to the window. Below, Reverend Brooks met her gaze from the street, lifting a hand in silent solidarity. The walls of the courthouse, once so impenetrable, seemed to tremble under the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. And Simone Carter knew this day would be remembered, not because she wore the robe, but because in the moment they tried to strip her of everything, her dignity, her identity, her power, she chose to rise. She chose to lead. And the system that thought it could humiliate her was about to learn the hardest lesson of all. It had never truly held the power. She did. And now the whole world was about to see it. The atmosphere inside the Charleston Federal Courthouse had transformed from stunned silence to something more volatile, something electric. A reckoning was stirring, and at the center of it, seated with an unbreakable composure behind the bench, was Judge Simone Carter. But the morning's stunning reversal, the public exposure of Deputy Charles Brenner's brutality, was just the beginning. What was about to unravel would be far larger, far deeper, and far more devastating than anyone in that courtroom had yet realized. The first cracks began subtly. During the midday recess, Simone sat alone in her chambers, sipping a cup of now cold coffee, when her young clerk, Rachel Evans, knocked gently and slipped inside. Her face was pale, her hands visibly shaking as she held a manila envelope against her chest. "Your Honor," she said, voice tight with urgency, "you need to see this." Simone set her cup down carefully and reached for the envelope. Rachel placed it in her hand like it was something dangerous, something heavy. Inside were photocopies, pages and pages of them, complaints, 12 formal grievances filed over the past 15 years against Deputy Charles Brenner. Assault, harassment, excessive force, racial profiling. Each one bore the stamp of unsubstantiated or no further action required. Each dismissal had been signed by senior officials, department heads, administrative judges, and horrifyingly, by one name Simone recognized immediately: Judge Alan Whitmore, her former mentor, the man who had once promised her that she belonged on the federal bench, that he would pave the way for her success. Simone's stomach twisted violently. There it was in black and white, the systemic rot laid bare. Whitmore hadn't just turned a blind eye. He had actively protected predators like Brenner, ensuring complaints disappeared before they could threaten the image of the institution. Rachel's voice broke the silence. "Your Honor, there's more. You should know that several current staff members are ready to testify. They've been too scared until now." Simone pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. The pressure in her head was mounting, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Set up a secure room," she said. "I want sworn affidavits by the end of the day. No leaks, no media until we control the narrative." Rachel nodded and rushed out. Simone stared down at the papers again, each signature a betrayal. She had thought Brenner's assault was an isolated abuse, a shocking violation by a single man. But no, this was a system, a machine, and it had been operating in plain sight for years. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom had filled again. The word had spread beyond the courthouse now. The crowd outside was growing, spilling into the streets. Protesters, students, clergy, veterans. Inside, reporters jockeyed for position. Lisa, the young journalist who had watched it all unfold, now sat front and center, pen scratching furiously against her notepad. The bailiff called the court to order, and Simone re-entered the room, every eye snapping toward her. She sat, tapped her gavel once, and nodded to the prosecution. "Your Honor," the lead prosecutor said, voice carefully controlled, "the government respectfully requests to enter new evidence into the record regarding patterns of misconduct involving courthouse personnel." "Proceed," Simone said, her voice even. The prosecutor approached the evidence table with a heavy binder. "These documents," she said, opening it for the jury and gallery to see, "detail a history of suppressed complaints against Deputy Charles Brenner, facilitated by deliberate administrative negligence and abuse of authority." She lifted a sheet. Exhibit 12B, a 2011 complaint filed by a black attorney alleging unlawful detainment by Deputy Brenner, dismissed within 48 hours without review. Another. Exhibit 12C, a 2015 internal memo warning about racially insensitive behavior by Brenner, ordered sealed by then Chief Judge Alan Whitmore. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Simone sat perfectly still, her jaw tight. There it was, inescapable, irrefutable, not a flaw, not an accident, a system built on silence, shielded by bureaucracy. She looked out over the room. Attorneys were whispering furiously. Officers at the back of the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Even some of the defense attorneys looked rattled. And the jury, God bless them, the jury leaned forward, jaws clenched, faces grim. They understood now. This wasn't about one bad cop. This was about all of them. As the prosecution laid out the documents, the true scale of the betrayal unfolded. Witnesses were called, former courthouse clerks, security officers, even a retired janitor, each telling eerily similar stories. "I filed a complaint after Brenner slammed a 65-year-old man against the wall outside this very courtroom," one former security officer testified, voice shaking. "Judge Whitmore told me it was being handled internally. Nothing ever came of it. I was warned not to rock the boat if I wanted to keep my job," a records clerk whispered. "People who complained found themselves reassigned, demoted, or quietly forced out," said another. The pattern was undeniable. The system hadn't just failed victims. It had hunted down anyone who dared to speak. At the afternoon break, Simone retreated to her chambers. The tension coiled in her chest like a serpent. She stared at herself in the mirror, the uneven hair, the raw scalp, the eyes that no longer held even a sliver of naivete. There was a knock. Rachel Evans stepped in, followed by a new figure, Special Agent Michael Reyes from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. He was tall, black, dressed in a crisp gray suit, and carried a solemn air. "Your Honor," he said, extending a hand, "I'm Agent Reyes. We've been dispatched to open a formal investigation into misconduct at this courthouse, effective immediately." Simone shook his hand firmly. "Good. You'll find no shortage of evidence." He nodded grimly. "We believe so. I've reviewed preliminary materials." He set down a new folder, thicker than the last. "This," he said, "isn't just about Brenner. It's about an entire ecosystem of negligence. And from what I'm seeing, it starts at the top." Simone didn't flinch. "I'll testify under oath," she said simply. "Whatever it takes." Reyes smiled, a rare flicker of admiration in his eyes. "We're going to need people like you." Back in the courtroom, the mood had turned. It wasn't fear anymore. It was fury. It was awakening. One by one, names were read into the record. Supervisors who had buried complaints, judges who had dismissed lawsuits, administrators who had doctored reports, and at the center of it all, Judge Alan Whitmore, her mentor, her betrayer. The prosecutor produced an internal email from 2014, signed by Whitmore, urging that a certain demographic needed to be handled discreetly to preserve public trust. The words stung like fresh wounds. Simone sat motionless as the courtroom reacted. Shouts, gasps, cries of disbelief. Reporters bolted from their seats to send breaking news alerts. Lisa, her pen flying, captured every word, her face flushed with the gravity of the moment. Simone drew a long, steady breath. It would be easy to rage, to grieve, but that wasn't why she was here. She was here to finish it, to tear it all down. At the end of the day, as the courtroom emptied under the heavy gray sky, Simone stood alone at the bench. Rachel approached quietly, holding her coat. "You were incredible today, Your Honor," she said, voice thick with emotion. Simone gave a small, tired smile. "We're not done yet," she said. "Not by a long shot." Outside, the crowd had swelled again. Hundreds now, holding signs, chanting, singing. The fight for justice wasn't confined to these walls anymore. It had ignited something far bigger. Simone stepped out onto the courthouse steps, her robe billowing behind her like a banner. And for the first time in a long time, maybe the first time ever, she felt it. Not fear, not loneliness, power, but the right kind of power, the power of truth. And this time, they weren't going to silence her, or anyone else, not ever again. By the next morning, the Charleston Federal Courthouse no longer belonged solely to the system that once guarded it like a fortress. It belonged to the people. Word of what had happened, of the humiliation, the exposure, the rot that Judge Simone Carter had ripped into daylight, had spread like wildfire through Charleston and beyond. Social media was ablaze with footage and first-hand accounts. News outlets ran back-to-back coverage, with talking heads debating the implications. Local and national figures alike were now paying attention. And outside the courthouse, the streets were alive. Hundreds had gathered at first, then thousands. Citizens holding signs, waving flags, chanting for justice. Churches had mobilized. Student groups arrived by the busload. Veterans in worn jackets stood shoulder to shoulder with young activists in sneakers and hoodies. Black, white, Latino, Asian, diverse faces unified by outrage and hope. At the heart of it all, the courthouse stood silent and towering, as if bracing for the storm it could no longer contain. Inside, Judge Simone Carter sat at her bench, robe draped over her shoulders like armor, preparing for another day of hearings. But today was already different. The courtroom was packed to standing room-only capacity. Supporters squeezed into pews alongside journalists and legal observers. At the front, House Representative Carla Simmons, a longtime advocate for civil rights, sat with a solemn expression. At Simone's side, Rachel Evans, her young intern, bustled between tables, organizing documents and whispering urgent updates. Rachel paused at the bench, cheeks flushed with adrenaline. "Your Honor, Reverend Brooks just arrived. He's outside leading a peaceful march toward the courthouse steps. He asked me to tell you, Charleston's with you." Simone nodded once, her throat tightening. "Thank you, Rachel." In the gallery, she caught sight of Lisa, the young journalist who had been there from the beginning. Lisa sat straight-backed, a recorder running, her pen flying furiously over her notepad. This moment wasn't just being witnessed, it was being written into history. As the first case of the day was called, the noise outside grew louder, a rolling wave of chants and songs that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls themselves. "Justice for all! No more silence! We stand with Simone Carter!" The sound wasn't disruptive. It was invigorating, a heartbeat for a new beginning. The morning testimonies continued, peeling back the final layers of systemic rot. Records of suppressed complaints, forged documents, whispered deals between courthouse officials and law enforcement to maintain a facade of order at the cost of human dignity. And through it all, Simone sat tall, unmoving, her voice calm and measured, refusing to let fury or grief take her from her purpose. Every ruling she made was deliberate. Every word was precise. She was no longer just a judge overseeing a trial. She had become something larger, an emblem of a community's hunger for accountability, for dignity, for change. By noon, the energy outside had reached a fever pitch. Reverend Samuel Brooks stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by local clergy, community organizers, and citizens who had once believed the system would never hear their voices. The sun beat down on his shoulders as he adjusted the microphone, clearing his throat before speaking. "They tried to humiliate one of our own," Samuel said, voice ringing out across the plaza. "They tried to strip her of her dignity. They tried to bury the truth." A chorus of "Amen" and applause followed. "But they forgot one thing," he continued. "You can bury a seed, but it will grow back stronger." Today we stand with Judge Simone Carter, not just because she survived their hatred, but because she is showing us how to tear down injustice with grace, with courage, and with law. The crowd roared in approval. Meanwhile, inside, Simone heard the chants echo through the building as she prepared to call the next witness. Special Agent Michael Reyes from the Department of Justice sat ready at the prosecutor's table. He had already begun coordinating a federal investigation that would dig into every hidden corner of the courthouse and its long, protected network of corruption. Today was no longer about one woman's humiliation. It was about who got to define justice and who got to demand it. The afternoon brought another surprise. The doors to the courtroom opened, and in walked more than 24 individuals, former complainants against Charles Brenner, the deputy whose unchecked violence had set this all in motion. Men and women, young and old, some leaning on canes, others pushing strollers. They had come at last to be seen. Simone watched them take their seats, her heart hammering behind her calm exterior. This was why she hadn't given up. This was why she had taken that walk back into the courtroom after they humiliated her. Because her fight was bigger than her own survival. The prosecution called their next witness, and the stories kept pouring out. Tales of being ignored, dismissed, brutalized. And with every testimony, the truth grew too large to deny. Outside, the protests swelled into something almost celebratory. Marchers linked arms. Musicians played guitars and drums. Families brought children, explaining in quiet, reverent voices that they were watching history unfold. Reporters stood on makeshift stages, delivering live updates. Drones hovered overhead, capturing the ocean of humanity that had flooded the square. And high above it all, on the courthouse balcony, Judge Simone Carter briefly stepped into the sunlight. The crowd below erupted into cheers. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, a living monument to what dignity in the face of injustice looked like. And for a moment, even the loudest voices quieted. Because sometimes the act of standing is the most powerful message of all. Inside the courthouse, Lisa filed her live story under a headline that would later trend nationwide. Judge Carter's courtroom, where truth finally broke through. She wrote about Simone's unwavering strength, the flood of suppressed testimonies, the ripple effect the hearings were causing across the country. Emails flooded in from activists, law students, and ordinary citizens inspired by the unfolding events. Some offered legal aid, some offered their voices, some simply said, "Thank you." That evening, as the hearings recessed for the day, Simone walked down the courthouse steps, not through the back, not through private exits, but through the main doors, right into the waiting crowd. Rachel Evans was at her side, holding Simone's coat. Michael Reyes stood nearby, speaking quietly into his phone, coordinating the next steps of the DOJ investigation, and Reverend Brooks stepped forward, extending his hand. Without hesitation, Simone took it. Together they faced the crowd. The chants resumed, but softer now, almost reverent. "Thank you, Judge Carter. Stand tall, Judge Carter. We believe. Tears prickled behind Simone's eyes, but she blinked them back. This wasn't about her emotions. It was about the work. The work was only beginning. She raised her hand once, not to command attention, but to acknowledge them, to let them know she saw them just as they had seen her. And under the golden wash of the setting sun, it became clear. Simone Carter wasn't just the judge in a courthouse anymore. She was the people's judge. She was their line in the sand. And from this moment on, justice in Charleston, and maybe even across the country, would have a new face. One that wasn't built on silence or fear. One that looked like Simone Carter. The morning after the courthouse steps overflowed with chants of solidarity and hope, Judge Simone Carter sat behind her desk in her chambers, staring at a single unmarked manila folder. Inside were drafts, early versions, scratched notes, and legal frameworks that Simone had been quietly building long before the public ever knew her name. She hadn't written them for attention or for politics. She had written them out of necessity as a blueprint for a world where what had happened to her and to countless others would never happen again. And today, those drafts would become law. Across town, banners hung from balconies. Justice for all fluttered alongside American flags. Children chalked messages of hope on the sidewalks. News vans lined the streets. Cameras pointed at the courthouse like sentinels. But inside the chambers, there was no ceremony, no cameras, just Simone, her team, and a mission that had been forged in humiliation, pain, and resolve. Rachel Evans, the young intern whose courage had helped spark this transformation, stood near the door, clutching a stack of freshly printed documents. "They're ready, Your Honor," Rachel said, her voice steady but tight with emotion. Simone looked up, smiled gently, and reached for her robe. Today, the robe wasn't just tradition, it was armor and a promise. The courtroom was packed again, this time not for a trial, but for something bigger, a formal address. The atmosphere was electric, yet reverent. Reverend Samuel Brooks sat near the front row, his hands folded in prayer. Behind him were families, students, retired workers, citizens who had been forgotten by the very system they were now helping to rebuild. At the press tables, young journalist Lisa adjusted her recorder. She wasn't just covering a hearing anymore. She was witnessing a movement. Judge Simone Carter stepped onto the bench, robe flowing around her shoulders. She tapped her gavel once. The room fell instantly silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clear and strong across the marble walls. "The events of the past weeks have exposed not just the misconduct of individuals, but the failure of institutions that allowed such conduct to flourish unchecked." A low murmur ran through the gallery. Agreement, outrage, sorrow. Simone continued, "We can no longer pretend that the acts of Deputy Charles Brenner were isolated. They were protected. They were enabled." Her gaze swept the room, locking eyes with familiar faces, some ashamed, some proud. "And because of that, today I am announcing the implementation of a sweeping reform, the Carter Mandate." The words struck like a drumbeat, rippling across the courtroom. Rachel stepped forward, handing Simone the official documents. Simone held them up. "This mandate will apply to all federal courthouses under this district's jurisdiction, effective immediately." She read each section aloud, her voice unwavering. "First, mandatory anti-bias training for all courthouse employees, including judges, deputies, clerks, and administrative staff. No exceptions. No grandfather clauses," Simone emphasized. "If you serve the people, you must be trained to serve all the people." Second, creation of an independent oversight committee made up of citizens, civil rights attorneys, and retired judges with spotless records. This committee will have the authority to review complaints, subpoena records, and recommend disciplinary actions without interference from internal courthouse politics. Third, Implementation of a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, harassment, or racial profiling inside any courthouse or during courthouse-related activities. Violations, Simone said clearly, will result in immediate suspension pending investigation and, if warranted, termination and federal charges. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of shock and hope. From his seat near the aisle, Special Agent Michael Reyes watched with a quiet nod of approval. His own investigation had unearthed deep layers of corruption tied to Deputy Brenner, former Judge Alan Whitmore, and others. But what Simone was proposing, what she was enacting, was bigger than any one case. It was systemic triage, and it was long overdue. Lisa, in the press section, scribbled furiously in her notebook. Her headline was already forming: Judge Simone Carter launches Carter mandate to overhaul federal courthouses. A new era begins. Simone wasn't finished. There is one more provision, she said, her tone hardening. Every complaint filed against courthouse personnel over the past 20 years will be reopened and reviewed by the Independent Oversight Committee. A gasp rippled through the room. That meant skeletons buried under decades of silence would be exhumed. Names long protected by power would be laid bare. Rachel Evans, standing near the bench, bit her lip to suppress the swell of emotion inside her. She knew this wasn't just procedural, it was personal. For her, for Simone, for every intern, every visitor, every citizen who had been made to feel small and powerless in these marble halls. Simone Carter laid the documents down with finality. This mandate will not fix everything overnight, but it is a beginning. And beginnings, she said, are how revolutions are born. The room erupted, not into applause, but into something stronger, a standing ovation, silent, unified, full of tears, nods, clenched fists raised in solidarity. Even the attorneys who once defended Brenner looked on with a grudging respect they could not conceal. Simone stood tall behind her bench, letting the moment breathe. Then in a voice just loud enough to be heard over the standing crowd, she said, "Court is adjourned for today, but the work is only just beginning." Outside, the crowd that had gathered heard word of the mandate through whispered updates, then through cheers and chants. TV reporters rushed to set up live streams. Students from the University Law School nearby handed out printed summaries of the Carter mandate to anyone who wanted to read them. Reverend Brooks lifted his hand skyward and led a prayer of thanksgiving and determination. Across the plaza, murals were already being painted, images of Simone, not as a figurehead, but as a symbol, stern, proud, unbroken. Later that evening, Simone sat alone in her chambers, robe draped carefully over the back of her chair. Rachel entered quietly, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She set one in front of Simone and sat down opposite her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Rachel said softly, "You know they're already calling it the Carter Courthouse out there." Simone gave a small, almost wistful smile. "Names fade, work doesn't." Rachel hesitated. Then braver now, she asked, "Do you think it'll really change things?" Simone looked at her, eyes steady. "Yes," she said, "because today we planted something deeper than fear. We planted truth. And truth," she added with a half smile, "has a way of taking root when you least expect it." Rachel nodded, her chest swelling with pride. Outside, the sunset blazed gold over the courthouse dome. The same courthouse that had once humiliated Simone, now transformed into a symbol of resilience and renewal. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more headlines, more resistance. But for tonight, they had taken back something that couldn't be taken away again: their dignity, their voice, their power. The day of reckoning arrived beneath a sky smeared with bruised gray clouds, as if nature itself understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Inside the Charleston Federal Courthouse, The air was heavier than it had been in weeks. Not the weight of oppression this time, but the slow, steady weight of justice finally catching up. Deputy Charles Brenner, once a figure of unchecked authority within these halls, now sat in the defendant's box. No badge on his chest, no smug grin on his face. His uniform had been replaced by a plain gray suit, the cheap kind issued by the county. His wrists were cuffed in front of him, chains rattling quietly when he shifted in his seat. Judge Simone Carter entered the courtroom through the main doors, not through the private side passage reserved for judges. No, today she would walk straight into the storm she had helped create, head held high, robes sweeping behind her like the tide coming to reclaim the shore. Everyone stood, not merely out of tradition, but out of reverence. She took her seat at the bench, tapped her gavel once, and the courtroom fell into absolute reverent silence. Deputy Charles Brenner, Simone began, her voice smooth but cutting. You stand before this court convicted of multiple counts, including abuse of power under color of law, violation of civil rights, and obstruction of justice. She paused, letting the words sink into the crowded gallery, where Reverend Samuel Brooks sat among rows of citizens, some who had come from nearby neighborhoods, others who had driven hundreds of miles to witness this moment. In the course of your duty, Simone continued, you assaulted, humiliated, and violated the very people you were sworn to protect. You perpetuated a culture of fear, racism, and unchecked brutality. You used your authority not as a shield for the vulnerable, but as a weapon against the powerless. Brenner didn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, jaw tight, as if bracing for a blow he knew he could no longer avoid. Simone leaned forward slightly, the robe pooling around her arms like dark waves. This court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, she said. 6 years for abuse of power, 5 years for civil rights violations, 1 year for obstruction of justice. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmured prayers and quiet sobs. And, she added, her voice slicing through the murmurs, you will serve these sentences consecutively, not concurrently. Brenner flinched for the first time that morning. From her seat, young journalist Lisa scribbled notes furiously. Her headline practically wrote itself, Deputy Brenner sentenced to 12 years. Judge Simone Carter declares end to era of abuse. Across the room, Rachel Evans wiped away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. It wasn't just about Charles Brenner. It was about the message now carved into the foundation of this courthouse. No one was untouchable, not anymore. Special Agent Michael Reyes, seated near the prosecution, allowed himself a rare, small smile. His months of work uncovering the suppressed complaints, the hidden memos, the buried reports had not been in vain. The system had tried to eat itself from the inside out, but today the infection was being cut away, piece by piece, starting with Brenner. As the judge's words echoed across the chamber, Reverend Brooks bowed his head in silent prayer. Let this be the first stone cast in the rebuilding. Simone wasn't finished. She turned her sharp gaze toward the courtroom staff, the attorneys, the marshals who had once turned their heads when Brenner's misdeeds became too obvious to ignore. This is not a day of celebration, Simone said, her voice low but resonant. This is a day of reckoning, of acknowledgement. She glanced down at her notes, then back up. The culture that protected Deputy Brenner was not an accident. It was a choice, 1,000 small choices made by those who preferred comfort over courage, silence over truth. Her words struck not like accusations, but like indictments, personal and precise. No more. She rapped her gavel once, not in anger, but in finality. 2 U.S. Marshals approached the defendant's box. Brenner stood slowly, heavily, his chains rattling in the stunned silence. The courtroom watched, unblinking, as he was escorted out through the side door. Not the front door he had once strode through with casual arrogance. As the door swung shut behind him, It felt less like a simple exit and more like a door slamming closed on an era. Outside, the sky finally cracked open with a rumble of thunder, the first heavy drops of rain splattering onto the courthouse steps. The gathered crowd didn't disperse. They stayed, umbrellas popping open, jackets pulled tighter, standing vigil as if to bear witness to the end of something poisonous. Inside, Simone set down her gavel and rose from the bench. She walked slowly down the steps, past the rows of onlookers, past her own staff, and stopped in front of the press pool. The reporters surged forward, microphones outstretched. Lisa was the first to find her voice. "Judge Carter," she said, breathless, "what do you want the public to take away from today's ruling?" Simone's eyes burned with quiet fire. "That justice," she said, "is not a monument you visit when it's convenient. It's a living, breathing promise you fight to keep alive every single day." She turned without another word, robe trailing behind her like a banner. Later that afternoon in her chambers, Simone stood in front of the mirror. She removed her robe carefully, hanging it on its familiar hook. The scars on her scalp, still faint but healing, caught the light from the window. She touched them lightly, not with shame, but with reverence. They were a map of where she had been, and proof that she had survived it. Rachel Evans knocked gently on the doorframe. "Your Honor?" Simone turned. Rachel's eyes were wide, shimmering with tears she hadn't let fall earlier. "You did it," she said simply. Simone smiled softly. "We did it." Rachel stepped forward and placed a small box on Simone's desk. Inside was a simple silver pin, shaped like a phoenix rising from flames. Rachel cleared her throat, voice trembling slightly. "From the interns, the staff, the people who never thought anyone would listen." Simone picked up the pin, her fingers brushing over its delicate wings. No speech, no grand pronouncement. She simply pinned it onto her lapel. A new symbol, a new standard. That evening, as twilight bled into night, Simone Carter walked the courthouse halls alone. The same halls where Charles Brenner had once swaggered, where silence had once been the price of survival. But now silence had been broken, and in its place something better had taken root. When she exited the building into the warm night air, a small group stood waiting quietly on the courthouse steps. Students, elders, workers, reporters, citizens. As she descended the stairs, one by one they began to clap. Not loudly, not for show, but with the deep, slow rhythm of acknowledgement, of gratitude, of change. Simone paused at the base of the steps, looking out over the gathered faces, and nodded once. An unspoken promise that the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. She turned toward the city stretched out before her, the courthouse lights blazing behind her like a beacon. And then she walked forward into the night. Unbroken, unyielding, unstoppable. The morning air in Washington, D.C. was crisp, touched with the faint scent of fall leaves stirring along the wide marble steps of the White House. A small crowd had already gathered beyond the security gates, bundled in jackets, holding handmade signs that read, "Justice owes her a debt." "Thank you, Judge Carter." Courage looks like this. Inside the East Room, the atmosphere was electric with quiet reverence. High-ranking officials, civil rights leaders, and dignitaries sat shoulder to shoulder in polished rows. Cameras from every major network in the country lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like tiny hearts. At the front, on a raised stage adorned with the presidential seal, stood a simple podium. Draped in burgundy velvet beside it was a medal few Americans would ever see, let alone wear. The Presidential Medal of Justice, awarded only to those whose actions had fundamentally shifted the nation's understanding of fairness, law, and dignity. Today it would be pinned to the chest of Judge Simone Carter. From the side entrance, Simone stood waiting, flanked by Rachel Evans, her former intern turned protege, and Reverend Samuel Brooks, who had flown in from Charleston just for this moment. Rachel adjusted Simone's robe lightly at the shoulders. "You're ready," she whispered. Simone smiled gently, her heart hammering in her chest, not from nerves but from the sheer enormity of what this moment represented. Not for her, for every voice that had been silenced, for every hand that had reached out for justice and been slapped away. The doors opened. The announcer's voice rang clear through the East Room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the Honorable Judge Simone Carter." The room stood as one. Simone walked forward slowly, deliberately. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing like a drum beat through history itself. She passed faces filled with admiration and gratitude. Civil rights icons, young law students, sitting judges, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by her fight. At the podium, the President of the United States smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice carrying both gravity and pride, "your unwavering courage, your relentless pursuit of truth, and your fearless leadership have ignited change not just within a courtroom, but across a nation." He turned toward the gathered audience. "When others turned a blind eye, you stood your ground. When you were silenced, you spoke louder through action. And when the system tried to strip you of your dignity, you built something stronger than shame. You built hope." The president lifted the Presidential Medal of Justice from its case and gently draped it around Simone's neck. The gold glinted under the chandelier's soft light, but Simone barely noticed. Her focus was on the faces in front of her, the people she had fought for, knowingly or unknowingly, for most of her life. The president stepped back and gestured for her to speak. Simone Carter stood tall behind the podium, the medal resting just below her collarbone. She looked down for a moment, gathering herself, then lifted her gaze, calm and unwavering. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she began, her voice carrying not just across the room, but straight into the hearts of every person watching. "Not because I wasn't qualified, not because I didn't fight for it, but because for too long, the systems of this country were never designed with people like me in mind." A heavy silence blanketed the room. No one shifted. No one dared to look away. "I wore the robe," she continued. "I sat on the bench. But long before I was Judge Carter, I was just Simone, a young girl who was taught to be twice as good for half as much. I know what it feels like to be overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed." She paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. "But when they tried to strip away my dignity in that courthouse, when they shaved away my crown strand by strand, they didn't break me." Her voice deepened, filled with an iron steadiness. "They revealed me." Murmurs of emotion rippled through the crowd. They revealed the sickness buried inside our institutions, the rot of bias, fear, and complicity. And once revealed, it could no longer hide. She leaned slightly toward the microphone. "I did not stand and fight because I was fearless. I fought because I was terrified of what would happen if I stayed silent." She locked eyes with the front row, where Rachel Evans stood, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "This medal is not just mine. It belongs to every person who ever sat alone in a room and thought no one would believe them. Every soul who said this isn't right and was told to be quiet. Every student, worker, protester, and dreamer who believes that justice must be demanded, not politely requested." The applause began slowly, swelling like a tidal wave. Simone waited for it to crest, then finished softly. "Change doesn't come easy. It doesn't come quickly, and it doesn't come without scars. But it comes when ordinary people choose to stand anyway." Her final words floated in the charged air. "Today, and every day after this, let us keep standing." As she stepped down from the podium, Simone caught sight of Special Agent Michael Reyes standing near the rear. He offered a respectful nod, the kind one warrior gives another. At the back of the room, journalist Lisa wiped her eyes with the corner of her notepad, heart hammering as she realized she wasn't just documenting a speech, she was witnessing history. In the days that followed, Simone Carter's story spread like wildfire. Clips of her speech played on every major network, cut into montages that showed not just her moment at the podium, but the long, grueling road that had led her there. The courtroom reckoning, the Monroe Mandate, the fall of Charles Brenner and those who had enabled him. Young women across the country shaved their heads in solidarity, posting photos with hashtags like "She's Stand with Simone" and "Crown Unbroken." Law schools introduced new courses on courtroom ethics and racial justice, naming special scholarships after her. Civil rights leaders praised her for not just surviving the system, but for daring to rebuild it from the inside out. And perhaps most moving of all, survivors of injustice, those who had once been too afraid to speak, began coming forward in droves. Inspired by Simone's story, they found their voices, one testimony at a time. One afternoon, as Simone sat quietly in her Charleston home, sipping tea on her porch, she received a letter, handwritten, the ink slightly smudged. It read simply, "Because of you, I spoke up. Because of you, I stayed standing. Because of you, I still believe in justice. Thank you." A grateful stranger. Simone pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. She hadn't sought fame. She hadn't sought glory. She had sought truth. And in doing so, she had become something far more enduring, a symbol, a light, a beginning. The story of Judge Simone Carter teaches us that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. In a system designed to silence her, humiliate her, and erase her dignity, she chose to stand taller than the forces trying to break her. Simone's journey reminds us that injustice often hides behind polished institutions and formal titles. But the true measure of justice lies in the actions of those brave enough to confront it. Her refusal to back down after being stripped of her outward identity shows that real power comes not from how others perceive us, but from how firmly we hold on to our inner truth. Simone's grace under pressure revealed a deeper truth we all need to remember. Silence protects the status quo, but speaking out, even when it's terrifying, can spark change that reaches far beyond our own lives. Her leadership in creating the Monroe Mandate proves that change doesn't just happen with anger or outrage. It happens with careful, relentless action. Policies, reforms, accountability, these are built by those who endure the storm and still choose to build a better future. Another powerful lesson from Simone's story is the importance of visibility and representation. Her presence on the bench, her shaved head, her unwavering gaze, all sent a message to every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. You do belong. You are powerful, you are worthy, and your voice matters. She became a symbol not because she sought the spotlight, but because she was willing to endure humiliation without losing her humanity. In life, many of us face situations where we are underestimated, disrespected, or dismissed. Whether it's in our workplace, our communities, or even within our own families, the temptation is strong to shrink ourselves, to stay quiet just to survive. But Simone Carter's story challenges us to rise anyway, to claim our space, to insist on our dignity. Not for the sake of revenge, but for the sake of those who are watching, those who are still learning what strength looks like. Moreover, Simone's example teaches that systemic change requires systemic courage. It's not enough to point out a broken system. We must also have the vision and will to rebuild it. Through the Monroe Mandate, she demonstrated that true leadership doesn't just criticize problems, it offers solutions that outlast the moment. In our everyday lives, whether we're advocating for fairness at work, in our schools, or in our communities, We must remember that real reform is possible when we stay committed. Change is slow. It is exhausting, but it is also inevitable when we refuse to give up. Every small act, every time we speak up against bias, every time we mentor someone who's been overlooked, every time we vote for leaders who stand for integrity, ripples outward in ways we may never fully see. Simone's story shows us that you never know whose life you might change simply by standing firm in your values. Perhaps most importantly, Judge Simone Carter's journey reminds us that healing and power can coexist. After being dehumanized, she could have hidden, retreated, or chosen bitterness. Instead, she chose visibility. She chose leadership. She chose to turn her scars into standards, creating protections so that others would not endure the same cruelty she faced. It's a reminder to all of us that our wounds do not have to define us. They can strengthen us. They can forge the kind of wisdom and compassion the world desperately needs. Her ability to stand proud, bald-headed and regal, showed that strength isn't about appearing untouchable. It's about standing in our truth, scars and all, and saying, "This is who I am, and I am enough." As we reflect on Simone's story, we should each ask ourselves, where in our lives are we being called to stand up, even when it's hard? Where are we being asked to build something better, not just for ourselves, but for generations to come? Each of us holds a piece of the fight for justice within us. You don't need a robe, a medal, or a title. You just need the will to act, to speak, and to stand when others sit. If Judge Simone Carter's journey moved you, if it reminded you of the quiet power you hold, if it reignited your belief that change is possible, please don't keep that inspiration to yourself. Like this video, leave us a comment sharing what part of her story resonated with you the most, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more powerful, real-life stories that remind us of the strength in standing tall. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you're the first to hear every new chapter of courage, resilience, and hope we share. Together we can keep the flame of justice burning, one story, one voice, one brave step at a time.